Okay, good evening everybody, and good evening to everybody who's watching. Speak up, a word is not just a word. That's the theme of tonight's lesson. The name of this week's Parsha is Parshas Emor, and Emor means to say. Now, words have an enormous power. In fact, a number of years ago when I was involved in education, in elementary education, I recall purchasing a book called The Power of Words, because especially with children, we want to be extra careful with what we say. Words are very powerful. They can encourage, they can heal, and they could also cut down and destroy. And I'm sure we all either have had this experience in our own childhood, or we know people who had this experience where words either had a very positive or a very negative effect. Now, how far does this power extend? How far is this power? How strong is this power that we have with our words? Number one. Number two, we also want to talk about, before we circle back to the subject of words, the idea of being judgmental. Judging others. Judging others. It's very easy for us to sit in our ivory tower and look down at other people who are not like us or have not behaved the way we think is the best way to behave, and we judge them.
Were you looking at me?
I actually thought you were looking at me.
No, okay. No, it wasn't me. Don't stop.
I don't know what you're pointing to. Ella does.
Okay,
Power of words, and you're pointing.
there you go.
Yeah, I know. But they help sometimes.
Now, in many talks that the Rebbe used to give, he would point out that the names of the Parshios are associated with a larger theme that really speaks to the essence and the substance of the entire Parsha. So the name of the Parsha isn't just a name that was taken from the very opening verse of the Parsha. So for example, Korach. So Korach's name is mentioned right at the very beginning of his Parsha. So you might think that's the basis of the entire Parsha. Noach. The name of Noach, the name of Lech Lecha, Vayetze, Vayishlach. Every single parsha, we could take a look and we wonder, what's the reason why it's named that? Well, very simple, because the very first word, or the very first couple words, is that word, is that name. So use that as the beginning of the parsha. Call that the parsha. But the truth of the matter is, there's a lot more to it. It's a lot deeper than that. It's not a name of a parsha. The fact that a name by divine providence has become the identifying. The handle with which we identify the parsha demonstrates that name or that word encompasses within it the very soul of the parsha itself. And one of the proofs for this is that when it comes to Hebrew, the name of something isn't just a name that was agreed upon by humanity. That's a good name for this. When it comes to Hebrew, it's not like that. How do we know? Because Adam Rishon, we're taught, gave names for every animal, and it's based on their spiritual substance. So in other words, what he did was he perceived their godly source, and based on that, he gave them a name. So names are associated, they kind of speak to the essence and the substance of the matter. It's not just, just something that we came to a consensus as far as what would be a cool name to use, but the word shulchan actually tells us something about the actual shulchan, the actual table. Shulchan means table, but shulchan also is, as the Alter Rebbe explains in the Tanya, that the letters that comprise the word shulchan, the name shulchan, actually are the very source in the spiritual realms of the very source in the spiritual realms for the spiritual force that gives it its life. And so the same applies also to the Parshias. I hope I'm clear. Does that make any sense? Is that clear?
Yes.
In other words, whenever you have a name in Hebrew, the Hebrew name, because it's the Hebrew alphabet, those letters form the conduits through which divine energy is manifest and sustains that item. That's what I'm saying. Okay. So the beginning of our Parsha is in text number 1 here, on page 46. And God says to Moshe, speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, let none of you defile himself for a dead person amongst this people. Usually, the Parshias begin, or a section begins with Vayomer Hashem, and God spoke to Moshe. Here, it actually begins with the word Emor el Kohanim. Okay, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God says to Moshe, what does he say? Emor el Kohanim. Speak to the Kohanim. So he's commanding Moshe to speak to the children of Israel. What message does this contain? Emor el Kohanim. Speak to the Kohanim. It's an uncommon expression that we find. In other words, I don't know if we have this anywhere else in the Torah where Vayomer Hashem Moshe Emor el Kohanim. Sometimes it's daber, sometimes it's sav. Daber means to speak, but perhaps speak in a stronger way. Sav is command. But the term Emor seems to be a peculiar term. If we look in the Medrash has a whole explanation on this verse, and yet before and after the Medrash, it's not like we understand the verse any better, at least ostensibly on the surface. It doesn't seem like the Medrash adds anything to understanding the actual verse. Here's what it says in text number 2. Speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, on page 47, Rabbi Tanchum, the son of Rabbi Haniloi, expounded on the verse, and he expounds the following verse, which says that the sayings of God are pure sayings. This is Imres Hashem Amores Taheres. This comes from the Tehillim, from the Psalms. The sayings of God are pure sayings. So this sage goes and expounds on this verse, and he says, the sayings of God are pure sayings, in contrast to the words of flesh and blood, which are not pure sayings. Meaning, purity, meaning when you have two different elements mixed together. You have something that you have some elements that are good, some elements that are impure. So humanity is a mixture, of good and bad. So whatever they say is not going to be 100% pure like God's words. Common practice for an earthly king is to enter a city, and the entire population lauds him with praise, upon which the king proclaims, tomorrow I shall build for you public baths and bathhouses. Tomorrow I shall erect a canal of water. He then goes to sleep and does not arise, meaning he dies. Now where is he? And where are his sayings? In other words, the king, the human king, promises and doesn't deliver. However, God is not so. Rather, as the verse states, the Lord God is true. Hashem Elokim Emes, God is true. How is he true? Rabbi Avin said, the answer lies in the following words in the verse, for he is the living Lord and everlasting King. Shuhu Elokim Chayim Melech Olam, God is everlasting, he's eternal, he's enduring, he's true. And that's the reason why what he promises happens. This is what the Medrash says. Now, we might be left scratching our heads here. What does the Medrash actually mean? It tells us that, okay, God is real, God is true, God is enduring, God is eternal. Okay, wonderful, very good. But man is not like that. Man's words are not pure, God's words are pure. And now what? So how does that help us understand the word Emor el Kohanim? Like, what is that? When we're done with this Medrash, do we understand the verse Emor el Kohanim any better? It seems like not.
I didn't realize that they're describing God as living. How usually that's not a word that you use to describe God.
In Moda Ani, which we say right at the very beginning of our day, we say Moda Ani lefonecha, Melech Chai v'Kayim, the living and eternal God. He's real life. He's the true life. We have a shadow of a life. We have life that endures for 90, 100, 120 years. God willing, a good health. And after that?
But isn't that an anthropomorphic word for God?
Life? I wouldn't think so. Because what's real life? How do you define real life? We think life is the way we define it. We're not superimposing our physical life on God. Rather, it's the opposite. God is the real one who's lived, the one who's really living. And He's giving us a faint representation of that life that we can experience for 120 years. Okay. So back to our question. What does the Medrash mean? What does this mean that God's words are pure? And the word eternal. The Medrash is clear on using the word eternal, is insistent on we're using this idea, is invoking this idea that God is eternal, and therefore what? What does that have to do with anything? So we're going to come full circle, God willing, towards the end of the class to explain this Medrash. But in between, we're going to go off on a little tangent. Also, when Moshe is talking, God's telling Moshe, go talk to the Kohanim, right? Talk to the Kohanim. So if Moshe is talking, that's a human being talking. How do we measure that up against God's words? God's words are completely different. So we need to understand what this is all about. And also, and most importantly, why did the Medrash choose to explain this concept, that there's a big difference between the human king and God, on this pasuk? Like, what does one have to do with the next? What is the connection between the two? So, what does this contribute? All right.
Which pasuk?
The very first pasuk, in text number 1. Emor al Kohanim, Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Emor al Kohanim, speak to the Kohanim.
Yeah.
So the Medrash comments, what does it mean?
So it's the Medrash really says.
On this verse.
Okay.
Emor al Kohanim, then the Medrash kind of goes off on a tangent. God's words are pure, human beings' words are not pure, the king promises and he doesn't deliver. So what does one have to do with the next? What is the Medrash trying to tell us? There must be something here. The Medrash isn't just cute, monologues that the sages just went off on and that were transcribed and preserved for generations to come. But in fact, as we're taught by the Rambam and many others, that Medrash contains the greatest secrets in the Torah. It's just that very often they would garb their teachings in ambiguous language. So it's hard to understand, but if you dig deep enough, you can extract the message. Okay, let's take a detour for a moment and talk about judging others. Judging others. Now, to some degree, we all judge others. We all have to judge others. If we don't want to get run over, we have to judge others. We judge others, right? If we want to cross the street and stay alive, we have to judge others. This guy, he's speeding. He's probably not going to stop by the time I get in the middle of the street, so I better stand back. So we all have to use our judgment. Okay, it's a critical thing. So sometimes that judgmentalism, or prejudice, I should say, can get out of hand. We judge others. We sit there judging. So in Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe tells us that one of the ways that we can accomplish true humility is by what's called judging the other person in a favorable way. Finding the positive in the other person. In text number 3, true humility can be attained by following the instruction of our sages. Judge not your fellow man until you have stood in his place. For it is his place. This is an interesting diuk, an interesting nuance here that the Alter Rebbe points out in this expression of the Pirkei Avos. It says, judge not your fellow man until you have stood in his place. Why in his place? Says the Alter Rebbe, for it is his place, meaning his physical environment, that causes him to sin. After all, this person's livelihood compels him to go out about in the marketplace all day and linger about on the street corners. Thus his eyes see all sorts of temptation. And of course, what the eye sees, the heart desires. Additionally, it may be his spiritual place driving him to sin. For it could be that his evil nature burns like a baker's fiery oven. As it is written, it burns like a flaming fire. That's actually a quote. It is different, however, with a person who goes about little in the marketplace, and most of the day he's at home rather than at the street corners. He encounters less temptation, and even if he does go about the marketplace all day, yet it may be that he is not so passionate by nature, for the evil impulse is not the same in everyone. One person's nature may be more passionate and the others less so, as explained elsewhere. So it's difficult for us to sit here and judge whether or not that person is, how righteous that individual is. Now that still doesn't absolve that person. I want to be clear, that doesn't absolve that person of sin. If the person does a sin, ultimately they're responsible for the sin. However, for us to judge, we shouldn't be judging that person. We shouldn't sit here and judge. So yes, God judges that person. A person does something wrong, God will take care of whatever he has to take care of. But for us to sit here and judge that person, we need to think of things differently. We need to look at ourselves, and when we see somebody else not acting or not behaving correctly, we need to recognize that they are coming from their perspective, they're coming from their environment, they're coming from their education, from their background, from their, familial structure and context, and we have no clue what that might be like. No clue. And so we are not here to judge. We can't judge. And so this is something that the Rebbe tells us in Tanya, this is the way we can achieve humility. Because the lack of humility is, what do you mean? I'm righteous. Righteous indignation. I'm up here. That other person is down there. And actually, it kind of works simultaneously. When that person is down there, automatically, I kind of feel righteous enough that I should be here. I'm here, actually. So it feeds off. They feed off of each other. So we need to put people's actions and behaviors into context. So now the question becomes, but does that mean necessarily that there's no time and place for judging others? Is there no time and place to call a spade a spade? Simply objective reality. This is wrong. You want to make sure that your children see. If you want to demonstrate to your children something, there's a behavior that they may have seen, and you want to point out to them, by the way, this is not the way we behave. Is that wrong? Is that terrible? Is there something wrong with that? So here we're going to discover a little bit of nuance within this directive that we need to withhold judgment from others. In text 4a, page 49, here's what we read. Judge every man to the side of merit. This is what it says in Pirkei Avos. Judge every man to the side of merit. Where is that? That's in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we read the next statement, which was quoted by the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya earlier, which is, do not judge your fellow until you have stood in his place. What's the difference between the two? In the first case, we're told, judge every man to the side of merit. Here now we're told, don't judge your fellow until you have stood in his place. So, whenever we see somebody doing something that might be out of line, according to the first text, what do we need to do?
Benefit of the doubt.
Always give the person the benefit of the doubt. Always.
Then you have to correct them, don't you? They tell you to do that.
Definitely have to correct. Definitely have to correct if it's possible. I'm glad you're raising that because it's an important question. Within the obligation to correct.
Rebuke, that's what they say.
Yeah. So I would submit to you that rebuke can be a lot more effective when done in a non-rebuking fashion. In other words, I'll tell you, last week I was listening to a Dvar Torah from the Chabad Shliach in Syracuse. Not in Syracuse, at Cornell. Cornell's Rabbi Eli Silberstein, and he repeated an interesting thing. What he says is that there was a great genius, a great rabbi, a great sage in Hungary. His name was Rabbi Shimon Greenstein, or Greenbaum. I don't remember his last name exactly. He wrote a sefer Shilas U'Tshuvos, meaning the response of Maharshag. Rabbi Shimon Greenstein or Greenbaum, I don't remember his last name. Okay. Anyway, so he discusses this mitzvah over there of achiach tochiach, of rebuking the other person. And he brings an interesting medrash. The medrash says that Aaron HaKohen, the high priest, who was the brother of Moshe, if he ever sees somebody doing a sin, so he would go and become their friend. And then, the next time they wanted to sin, they would say to themselves, I can't sin. I'm Aaron HaKohen's friend. Aaron is friend with me. I can't go and sin. Can't do that. And this is the way he got people to abstain from sin. So he says, you see from the Medrash here, that the mitzvah of going and rebuking somebody oftentimes might actually take on a different outer trapping. It's going to look different. It's not going to look like some of the people we might see in different parts of the world, without getting too specific, where they don't like what their fellow Jews are doing, so they go out and they yell at them, or they throw stones, or they act in a very, very negative way. So, unlike that kind of behavior, the whole idea, the rebuke aspect, can take on a whole new, external fashion, external form. It's going to look different, because you're not going to gain anything by yelling at people, by putting people down, by judging them. The only thing you're going to gain, the only time you're going to gain something, is if you're friendly with people, you're respectful of people, and you simply model for them what it is that they should be doing. And sometimes I get questions like that from different people. They tell me, how do you do this, or how do you do that, or why do you behave this way, and how do you allow this, and how do you allow that? And I think this is the answer. This is the way. This is the way that we're taught. And Rabbi Silverstein actually shared another interesting anecdote. And after which I'm going to jump right back into our discussion. There was a Chassidish Rebbe from Zidichoiv. Zidichoiv, maybe Alan remembers where Zidichoiv. I believe Zidichoiv is in Poland. He was one of the Polish Hasidic Rebbes, not a Chabad Rebbe, but Hasidic Rebbe. And one time there was a rabbi from a neighboring city that came to him to tell him that some of his disciples, some of his Hasidim, were violating Shabbos. They were working all the way up until nightfall. They were hiring Gentiles to work their fields on the Shabbos. And do something about it. Talk to them. Stop them from doing it. So the Rebbe listened to what he said, but was quiet. A while went by, and this rabbi comes back, and he says, I didn't see any change, so you must have not spoken to them. At least say something, do something. So he says, these people always come to me for the holidays, for the high holidays, or for the three major holidays, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuos. And he says like this: every Jewish leader has their way of inspiring others, or they have their shlichus, they have their mission. And if these people have come to listen, he was a Baal Tefillah, apparently. He was a chazan in shul, or was the Baal Tefillah. He used to lead the prayers, and he had a very heartfelt davening. And so he said, if they are not inspired, if they are not moved to tshuva by just listening to my Hakoel Yeducha, which is a section of the davening in the morning on Shabbos, then there's nothing I can do more for them. Now, whether or not this would have been our attitude today, where we come from, I'm not sure. But the point remains the same, that he felt that the way that he was going to reach these souls, was through the inspiration that he was able to impart through his davening. That was his channel, that was his conduit to reach out to these people and elevate them and give them a sense of closeness to Hashem, for which reason they would follow what Hashem wants them to do. So again, this goes all within the same realm, the same discussion, the same framework that we've been discussing until now about this idea of Hechech Techiach. Okay, so going back to judging people. Is there a difference between these two statements over here? The straightforward meaning of this is to refrain from judging at all, since it is impossible to be in the other person's situation. An onlooker cannot judge a protagonist. So how do we behave moving forward? What are we supposed to do? What's the appropriate and correct balance? So Rabbeinu Yonah, who was one of the medieval scholars, his bio was on the side, was a great critic of Maimonides of the Rambam. And in fact, when the Rambam's works reached his city, he was an outspoken opponent of Rambam. to the point where he actually led or participated in the burning of one of Rambam's works because he felt that it was heretical. And later on in life, he recognized his mistake and pledged to travel to Israel to visit Rambam's graveside to beg his forgiveness. And to rectify his sin, he wrote a book called Sharei Tshuva. Sharei Tshuva, the gates of repentance. The gates of atonement. This is Rabbeinu Yonah. He was one of the very famous, great thinkers and halachic authorities of France in those days. So he writes like this in his commentary on the Ethics of the Fathers in text number 5. Judge every man to the side of merit. This speaks of a person about whom we either do not know whether he is righteous or evil, or even if we do know him, that he is generally a moderate person, sometimes doing evil and sometimes doing good. So if such a person does something that can be judged either way, unfavorably or also favorably, if there is any pretext upon which we can hinge a favorable judgment, we should take that approach. This applies even if the circumstances lean towards a guiltier judgment. So Rabbeinu Yonah is of the opinion that what are we talking about here? We're talking about an action that can be viewed in two ways. If there are two options in front of us, so now we have an option to go with the positive side. We have an option to go and judge them negatively. So instead, judge them positively. The opportunity exists. It's there. You have the leeway. You have the latitude to interpret things in a positive way. So that's all if we don't have all the facts. If we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure, so go and judge positively. Don't judge negatively. What happens if we have all the facts? It's objective and it's clear and it's obvious and there's no doubt about it. So then there may be room to judge a person. So now the question is there any place to find merit in a behavior or an action, although it is decidedly negative? So let's assume that we can judge in certain circumstances, limited circumstances, where we absolutely know for a fact that this person or this action was not a good one. Is there any room to, in those circumstances, to find merit with this person? Or should we just judge them? According to Rabbeinu Yonah, should we just judge them? In that case, we have all the facts, we know the circumstances. Is there still room to find merit, to find the redeeming factor?
But if the person is actually asked the other person, you have a better picture than just assuming. A lot of times when you really think you have the facts, you don't have the facts because you don't actually approach the other person to find out what.
Granted. And in that case, we say judge them favorably.
Right.
But here we're talking about if you know for a fact that this is the way it is. It was caught on video camera. They were interviewed by the police and interrogated, and they admitted to the crime, and they gave you their motive. You know the facts. Now the question becomes, is there any room, even in those circumstances, to find some kind of redeeming factor for this person? So before we answer the question, we're going to take another turn, and we're going to digress to the subject of Lashon Hara, to the subject of evil talk. In text number 6, there is yet a more severe sin apart from regular gossip, which is included in this prohibitive commandment, and that is Lashon Hara, one who spreads scandal about his fellow even though he is telling the truth. So unlike the misconception that Lashon Hara only applies when you're telling something that's not true, here we learned that Lashon Hara applies even if you're telling the truth. Absolute truth. It's still Lashon Hara. Okay. Now, in addition to this, there's an astounding statement in the Talmud and the Medrash, which appears here in text number 7. Lashon Hara, you guys are ready? I'm glad you're all sitting down. Kills 3 people. The speaker, the listener, and the subject. The speaker, the listener, and the subject. The instigator, the audience, and the subject of the discussion. It kills all 3. Now, you might ask yourself the question, okay, granted, it makes sense that the instigator and the audience should be punished for speaking Lashon Hara. So maybe that's what the Talmud means, that it kills them. But what about the subject? What did he do wrong or she do wrong? Why are they killed? What does the Talmud mean? Are we referring to a punishment here? So the answer is it's not that the subject is punished. Of course he's not punished. They're not punished. The subject is not punished. What do we mean? What the Talmud means here is that words have an impact. Words are powerful. Words have an impact. And that impact is going to affect this subject. The person will suffer as a result of having negative talk spoken about him or her. They're not aware of it. They're in another country. They're on the other side of the world. It makes no difference. There's a spiritual effect to be had by the words that we speak. There's an interesting, and I find it actually quite fascinating, statement here in text number 8. My teacher, the Holy Maggid of Mezrich, this is the Alter Rebbe writing, this is the author of the Tanya writing, my teacher, the Holy Maggid of Mezrich, had a unique custom. You ready? Immediately when a thought would fall into his mind, he would verbalize it, even if the audience didn't understand it too well. The Maggid did this because he wanted to draw down the thought into the world through verbalizing it, thereby enabling others to understand it. Even people at the other end of the world. They would be able to understand it simply because it was now extant in the world. By verbalizing something, he was drawing it down from its potential in the mind, in the spirit, and making it something that's actual, tangible, real. Just by verbalizing it. There's an interesting story that's told over of the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, where he had labored over a subject for a number of days. Don't forget who Rabbi Yosef Karo was. He was the author of the Code of Jewish Law. You can imagine the breadth and the depth of his knowledge and understanding. And yet, there was an issue that was very difficult for him to understand, and he labored over it for a number of days. And after he finished, he figured out what it meant, or he came up with an explanation, and he walked into the study hall. And he walks by one of the tables, and he hears one of the younger students sitting there studying the same subject, coming up with the same question, and in a split second, saying, oh, you know what the answer is? It's probably this. And it's the very same answer that he came up with, but after laboring over it for a number of days. Imagine how that made him feel. Here I have the youngest student over here. He's coming up with the answers that I couldn't come up with after a number of hours or days, until finally I came up with it.
By coming up with it.
There you go. That's the pshat. Because he had labored over it for a number of days, so in a spiritual sense, it had already manifested itself. It was here. The answer is here. It's just a question if this individual can tap into it. So, in a similar way, we sometimes view our words. Have you ever heard of Snapchat?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but...
Okay. Snapchat. Okay, I think everybody here,
It's one of the...
you probably need to leave this for the next generation.
It only lasts for a few minutes.
It only lasts for a few minutes.
Oh, right.
You type something, and after that, it's gone. It erases it. No record. No record. Unlike email, unlike Facebook, Twitter, people are going back to tweets that people put out there 2011, 2010, 2000, since the inception of Twitter.
That clogs your phone. All that clogs your phone.
But whatever the case is, the idea is that all of that information is saved.
Yeah.
It's on a database and everybody can access it. It's scary. Right? You're held to account by something you wrote 10 years ago. Maybe I changed my opinion since then. But you're held to account. And by the way, it's a great metaphor for recognizing that Hashem, as we say in the prayers of Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, that He has a book and He writes everything down in the book. Years ago it was hard to imagine. Hard to imagine such a thing. What do you mean? God has a book. Here you have it. It's no book. It's not a book. It's all electronic. There's no its own cyberspace,
It doesn't even need electrons.
and that's it, and everything is recorded there. Okay, so we sometimes think that our words are like Snapchat. They're there for a few minutes, and after that they disappear. There's no residual effect. But in fact, our words do have a residual effect. They have an impact. Either beginning with the psychological level, sometimes when we say something to somebody, especially when it comes to children and education, when we tell them something, that image that we draw for them in their minds remains with them. It could remain with them for a lifetime. And if it's a positive image, that will benefit them for the rest of their lives. If it's a negative image, they're going to fight that for the rest of their lives. And sometimes it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. My teacher said that I am this, therefore I will be that. Even though I have the potential not to be that. I have the complete set of skills that are not, but my teacher said it must be the truth.
Or my parents said it.
My parents, yeah. And this is universal. Words have an effect. That's on the psychological level. But even on a deeper level, in the spiritual realm, when we say something, we're actually taking something out from its potential state and bringing it out in the open. That's the idea of peh, of the mouth, being like malchus. We spoke about this in the Chassidish year. Malchus is one of the divine attributes. It's the final divine attribute, and it takes all that precedes it and makes it into something tangible, makes it into something that can be relayed to others. That's why the mouth is always the metaphor for malchus, for this final divine attribute. And now, based on all of this, we can understand the following Hayom Yom. You know, if you come here for davening in the morning, after davening every day, we read the Hayom Yom. Hayom Yom means today is the day. It was the day of. And each day has an entry. The entries are small snippets from talks of the previous Rebbe, different customs, most often, vignettes.
Is that before the
Teachings after davening. After davening. Short, 30 seconds. So here you have in text number 9, a Hayom Yom, that if you just hear it, just like that, it sounds a little strange. But I think based on everything we explained tonight, I think it'll be understood. A resident of Mezhebush, Mezhebush was the town where the Baal Shem Tov lived, had a quarrel with another. Once while in the Baal Shem Tov synagogue, he shouted that he would tear the other fellow to pieces like a fish. He was so angry, he said, "I'm going to tear you up like a fish." The Baal Shem Tov told his pupils to hold one another's hand and to stand near him with their eyes closed. Then he placed his holy hands on the shoulders of the 2 disciples next to him, and suddenly the disciples began shouting in great terror. They had seen that fellow actually dismembering his disputant. This incident shows clearly that every potential has an effect, either in physical form or on a spiritual plane that can be only perceived only with higher and more refined senses. What the Baal Shem Tov was doing was elevating his students temporarily to a spiritual realm where they were able to see a spiritual reality, and in that spiritual reality, the words that this fellow had used actually came to fruition. He was doing it in the potential state. That's, in other words, if you kind of climbed into this person's emotions as they are in their potential state, what you're seeing is the potential for a later action. It's just that potential hasn't been realized because the person didn't choose to do it. But if you were able to get in there, that's what you would see. What Baal Shem Tov was doing was raising his students to be able to see that world, see things from that perspective. So words have power. So just like there is a negative commandment against speaking negatively about our fellow, there is also, by the very same token, a mitzvah, a positive commandment to speak positive about others. Text number 10, we read in Rambam, every person is commanded to love another Jew as himself, or to love his fellow Jew as himself. As the verse states, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Therefore, one should speak in his praise. Because by speaking in the praise of the other, what are we doing? We're bringing out the good in the other person. Instead of bringing out the bad in the other person, we're bringing out the good. And so now the question becomes, how does this inform how we judge others? So the question we asked earlier was, in this circumstance, where the person's actions are decidedly wrong, decidedly evil, is there any place, ever, of course this needs discretion, is there any place, any appropriate time, when we should look for a positive dimension of this individual and talk about it? Or should this person be painted as completely evil and completely bad and terrible? And so, what this class is suggesting, what we're going to suggest here tonight, is that yes, sometimes what would actually remedy the situation, what would actually transform this individual from being a bad guy and beginning his journey or her journey onto a better path in life, is specifically pointing out the positive within them. In text number 11, he speaks praise of his friend and does not speak disparagingly at all. The actual speech that praises serves to reveal his praiseworthy qualities, which causes that the unsavory aspects of his character are weakened until they have totally disappeared. So we actually have the potential through our speech to have an effect on others, and we can reveal within others their positive potential. We can help others through our speech by speaking positively and complimentary about them, in a complimentary manner about them. When we do that, we actually cause that their positive qualities come to the fore and their negative qualities sink.
Yeah,
It's powerful.
you're here.
And so, we're going to have what to talk about, I think. Now, this we could take this a step further. Whenever a person sins, whenever a person is challenged, the more serious the challenge, the more this challenge testifies to the fact that we have the potential within ourselves to rise above the challenge and come out triumphantly. We can triumph over the challenge if we're given that challenge. By the fact that God is giving us the challenge, that means He's invested within us the power to be able to overcome it. And so now, this whole concept of speaking and revealing the positive dimensions of a person's personality through our speech takes on a whole new meaning. Now it's not just we're revealing positive sides, positive dimensions of the person. We actually have the power through our speech to help that person dig into their spiritual innards, their spiritual guts, if you will, and reveal that incredible fortitude that they really have within themselves. It's not just we're revealing, superficial qualities. We actually have the ability, through our speech, through the way we talk about others, to reveal within them the depths and the essence of their neshama. It's one of the reasons why the Rebbe was always very fierce in his defense of the Jewish people as a whole. He wouldn't take it sitting down if a rabbi got up and said that the Jews are sinners, that there are some Jews who are not eating kosher, that there are some Jews who are marrying out of the faith, or there are some Jews who are... He wouldn't take it sitting down if people spoke disparagingly about the Jewish people, even if they were great rabbis, wearing black hats and white beards. He would get up, I don't mean physically in the sense of physically getting up, but he would stand up and fiercely defend the Jewish people and talk about their positive aspects. And in last week's Parshas Kedoshim, it's called Kedoshim, it's called holy, because the Parsha begins with the mitzvah of being holy. We're supposed to be holy. Tish and Tiyah, we should be holy. And Rashi tells us at the very beginning of the parsha that this parsha was spoken b'hakel. Hakel means when you gather Jewish people together. And so the Rebbe points out something brilliant. He says, here you see that when Jewish people are gathered together, how do you first address them? Well, how do you open up your conversation? You talk about how they are a holy people. You talk about how they are a holy people and they have the potential to be holy and they have to be holy and they will be holy without a question, without a doubt. This is what's going to happen. You speak about it in the positive sense. God forbid to gather Jews together and speak about their negative. And he was passionately devoted to this. And in 1990, somebody had gotten up in Israel and spoken about how the kibbutznikim, they're doing this and they're doing that, and they eat this and they eat the other thing. And God forbid there'll be another Holocaust. And the Rebbe just would not take that. He was livid. How could you talk about Jewish people like this? You have to use your power of speech to reveal the positive in people. That's the way you're going to help their negative. Not just because it's a good thing to always remain positive. If you want to remedy the situation, that's the only way to do it. That's the way you're going to do it. By raising up their positive and just focusing on that. And so now, taking this first full circle, back to the subject of the medrash that was discussed earlier, we talked about how Hashem's words are pure. Hashem's words are pure because there's no negativity. By a Jew, we have the ability to either speak about the positive or the negative. We can go either way. And by Hashem, there's no lag between what he says and what he does. Whatever he says, immediately, that's what happens. As the pasuk says, "Kihu Amar Vayehi," we say that in the prayers every day. It comes from Tehillim. Hu Amar Vayehi. So Hashem's words, as soon as he says it, it happens. He has an incredible power of speech. As soon as he says something, that's what happens. And it's pure. It's always good. It's always positive. It's always the right thing. We need to emulate that. And God is telling that to us in our parsha. Emor ela kohanim. Speak to the kohanim. Use your power of speech for the positive. Don't speak negatively. Don't reveal the negative. Not lashon hara, not rechilos, whatever it might be. Use your power of speech for the positive. Bring out the good qualities within people. And then your speech will also be pure. Your speech will also reflect God. And that's the connection between human speech and God's speech. Yes, naturally we don't have. Naturally we're human beings. Obviously our speech is a little different than God's. We don't. What we say doesn't automatically generate worlds, but it does have an impact. And if we use it for the positive, then we are emulating God. And so that's the takeaway. We can't be afraid of speaking. You have to speak and get up and speak and continue to speak Emor and Emor and Emor and continue speaking, and God willing will have an effect. God willing will have the right effect on the audience that we have, and that will have an effect on the whole world, and ultimately we will experience seeing God's speech in everything. Because God's speech is manifest within everything. Of course, as we know, the Torah tells us, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'sa'aretz. How did God create the world? So the Pirkei Avos tells us, the ethics of the fathers tells us, Ba'asara ma'amoris nivra ha'olam, that God created the world with 10 utterances. One of them is actually Bereshis. The very first pasuk of the Torah is actually one of the utterances. Otherwise, the Torah tells us, Vayemer Hashem, God said there should be this, Vayehi Yer, Vayemer Hashem, and it was. And God said, and it was. God said, and it was. So it's through God's speech that things happen. Today we don't see that. Today we don't recognize it. Why don't we recognize it? So for that you have to come to the Chassidus here to understand why we don't recognize it. The fact that Hashem is creating the world through His speech, but ultimately, in the end of days, it's not that we want the end of days in the sense that that life will expire, God forbid, but rather the time to come, Mashiach's arrival will come, and Mashiach will arrive, and at that time, it says, "V'ro kol basar yachtov ki pi Hashem dibur." We'll see, all flesh will see that it's the mouth of God that has spoken. What does it mean? It's the mouth of God that has spoken. Not that God promised and the promise was fulfilled. Of course, that's also true. That's the simple, straightforward meaning. But in our context, all flesh will see ki pi Hashem dibur, that Hashem's mouth spoke. It means that we'll see the divine within the world, the divine within reality. No longer will we look out at the world and see something that seems to be distinct and separate from God. Rather, we'll see how in fact all of reality is attached to God, is an extension of God. It's just simply a manifestation of God. Okay.